At exactly 2:15 p.m. on a humid Tuesday afternoon, 6 weeks before my wedding, I was standing inside the Incident Command Center outside Seattle, tracking the rapid spread of the Cascade Mountain wildfires across 3 giant digital screens. As a senior emergency logistics coordinator for the Pacific Northwest, my job was to turn sheer chaos into structured survival, rerouting supply trucks through active smoke zones, securing emergency warehouse access at 3 in the morning, and making sure thousands of displaced families had clean water, insulin, and shelter before nightfall. In the middle of coordinating an urgent fuel delivery for a critical evacuation center, my personal phone began to vibrate violently against the steel desk. It was my mother, Evelyn Vance. I stepped out onto the quiet back porch of the command trailer, surrounded by the faint scent of pine smoke drifting from the ridge, and answered the call. I didn't even have the chance to ask if everyone at home was safe, or if she was calling about the wedding dress fitting scheduled for the upcoming weekend. Without a single word of greeting, my mother's voice came cutting through the receiver, cold, dismissive, and entirely free of hesitation. "Hannah, your wedding needs to be postponed. Your sister Chloe's engagement party is taking place that Saturday, and her event requires the family's full attention." Before I could even process the breath in my lungs, my father, Gregory Vance, took the phone from her hand and added his authoritative voice to the demand. "Your wedding is just a party, Hannah. Don't be selfish and ruin this milestone for your sister." For nearly 30 years of my life, those exact words, delivered with that familiar blend of parental authority and subtle emotional guilt, would have executed their intended programming without a hitch. The old version of me would have immediately apologized for causing inconvenience, spent 48 sleepless hours rearranging vendor schedules, and quietly convinced myself that sacrificing my own happiness was simply the dutiful, mature decision to make. But as I stood on that wooden porch, staring at the glowing evacuation maps and feeling the cool mountain wind against my face, something fundamental and ancient inside me became completely, unshakably still. In a single, quiet flash of clarity, I realized that the words, "Con rất mạnh mẽ," "You are so strong," and "Rất đáng tin cậy," so dependable, that my parents had wrapped around my shoulders like an heirloom cloak since childhood, were never meant as compliments. They were a sentence. In my family, being labeled the strong one simply meant I was the designated burden bearer, the child expected to absorb neglect, fund my own independence, and quietly swallow disrespect so that my younger sister Chloe could occupy the center of every room without disruption. I took a slow, deep breath, looked at the horizon, and whispered 4 quiet words into the phone. "Con hiểu rồi. I get it." Then, without waiting for their response, I tapped the red button and hung up. They assumed my answer meant compliance. What I actually meant was that I finally understood the nature of my own choices. 5 hours later, when I finally stepped into the quiet kitchen of our apartment after handing off the evening relief shift, my phone screen showed 11 missed calls and a string of frantic text notifications. I placed the phone on the kitchen counter, turned on the speaker, and played the voicemails in sequence while my fiancé, Julian Reed, poured a kettle of hot chamomile tea. In the first 3 recordings, my mother's voice carried her usual sharp, commanding tone, demanding that I call her back immediately to discuss the necessary adjustments. By the 7th voicemail, as the silence from my end stretched into hours, her tone shifted into rising panic and anger. By the final message, she was screaming so loudly into her phone microphone that her voice cracked, accusing me of coldness, arrogance, and threatening to expose my selfishness to our entire extended family if I didn't comply. Julian stood beside the counter in his faded jeans and a dark charcoal sweater, his standard work-from-home attire. listening to the tirade without interrupting once. When the final recording clicked off, leaving an echoing quiet in our kitchen, Julian didn't look angry or flustered. He simply set a steaming mug of tea in front of me, pulled his laptop toward us on the wooden table, and turned the screen around with a calm, gentle smile. A corporate search page filled the bright display, displaying the official executive leadership portal of Aegis Systems, the country's premier disaster management technology firm, whose real-time software platforms powered emergency response infrastructure across 37 states. Directly beneath the primary banner was an official photograph of Julian, taken nearly 9 years ago, clean-shaven, wearing wire-rimmed glasses, and standing beside a mobile command vehicle. Underneath the photo were the bold, official words, Julian Reed, founder and executive chairman. My family had spent the last 2 years treating Julian like an unremarkable, low-earning software consultant who was simply fortunate enough to marry into the prestigious Vance family. They had mocked his plain clothes, questioned his career stability, and once even moved his dinner plate to the far end of a charity gala table so a wealthy real estate developer could sit next to Chloe. They had no idea that Aegis Systems was a private technology giant valued at over $4.2 billion. Nor did my father realize that the unreachable corporate partner he had spent 8 frustrating months begging for an exploratory meeting with, the company whose software his construction consulting firm desperately needed to secure municipal contracts, was owned entirely by the quiet man whose ambition he had casually belittled over Sunday dinners. Julian leaned back in his chair, taking my hand in his warm palm, and looked at me with profound kindness. "They Googled your name earlier this afternoon, Hannah," he said quietly. "My assistant flagged a sudden influx of background inquiries coming from a private IP address registered to your mother's design studio." I looked down at my tea, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and profound liberation. The conflict brewing on the horizon was no longer just about a date on a calendar. It was about 2 decades of systematic entitlement colliding head-on with a boundary that could no longer be crossed. Chloe had recently engaged to Liam Cole, a polished commercial real estate broker, and my mother had decided that Chloe's engagement party needed to take place on the exact Saturday of my wedding, using my pre-booked luxury floral installations, my reserved hotel blocks, and my hired photographer to elevate Chloe's social media presence. They had assumed that my silence was a lifetime guarantee of my surrender. Sitting beside Julian, watching the rain begin to fall gently against our window, I opened my laptop, created a secure digital folder titled Wedding Interference, and prepared to document every single step of their impending collapse. By 8:15 the following morning, while I was sitting at my desk inside the Regional Incident Command Center reviewing emergency satellite overlays for active wildfire road closures near the Cascade foothills, the first wave of my family's covert operational interference officially landed in my inbox. My cell phone chimed with an incoming call from Sarah Lindquist, the lead floral designer whose boutique firm I had hired 11 months ago to create our wedding installations. She sounded visibly hesitant, clearing her throat twice before asking if I had personally requested a 70% reduction in our floral order and a full transfer of our pre-booked white orchid arches to another family event venue overlooking Lake Washington. When I told her I had authorized no such changes, Sarah breathed a heavy sigh of relief and immediately forwarded an email she had received at midnight. My mother had used her corporate email address at Evelyn Vance Event Studio to issue a formal revision request, attaching a fraudulent authorization letter signed with a digital rendition of my name. Beneath her signature, my mother had typed Evelyn Vance, mother of the bride and authorized family event coordinator, claiming that I was severely overwhelmed by emergency work stress and had requested a much simpler, understated ceremony. Attached to the bottom of her email was Chloe's complete engagement party order, a near-identical replica of my original design, down to the floating white orchids, suspended eucalyptus greenery, and custom brass aisle lanterns. She wasn't merely attempting to overshadow my celebration, she was actively stealing my vision, using my prepaid deposits to present it online as her own, assuming that my silence in the face of family conflict was a permanent guarantee of my compliance. I didn't lose my temper, nor did I shed a single tear. 15 years of coordinating complex disaster responses across storm-ravaged counties had trained my brain to treat unexpected interference not as an emotional injury, but as a severe system failure, requiring immediate containment and meticulous evidence gathering. I secured my account with the florist using a unique 60-character security passphrase, requested full digital copies of all email headers and timestamps, and instructed her to flag any future correspondence from my family as fraudulent. By noon, the event manager at the waterfront boutique hotel where I had locked in a 60-room guest block called my cell, reporting that a woman claiming to represent my wedding committee had tried to relocate 6 of our key out-of-town relatives to a budget motel 4 miles away to free up luxury suites for Chloe's social media sponsors. At 2:15 p.m., our primary wedding photographer forwarded an anonymous offer, offering him a $2,000 cash bonus if he departed my rehearsal dinner 2 hours early to cover Chloe's private cocktail reception. By 4 o'clock, my aunt forwarded a revised weekend schedule created on my father's firm workstation. My rehearsal dinner was officially labeled Optional Activity, Hannah and Julian, while Chloe's engagement brunch was highlighted in bold red as Primary Family Celebration. Every single maneuver was a calculated, documented attempt to dismantle my wedding from the inside, while using my reputation and money to fund Chloe's grand performance. By 5:30 that evening, my dining table looked less like a home in Seattle and more like a command center preparing for a federal deposition. Spread across the dark wood were 17 printed screenshots, 4 email headers, 2 audio recordings, and 3 revised itineraries detailing every fraudulent step my mother and sister had taken within 48 hours. Julian walked into the room carrying 2 glasses of sparkling water, paused beside my chair, and looked down at the neatly categorized folders with a quiet, analytical gaze. "You look like a lead prosecutor preparing a formal indictment," he observed softly, setting a glass beside my elbow. "I am preparing for my mother to deny everything," I replied, tapping the printed itinerary. "My father wrote this revised schedule. He uses Calibri font and underlines whatever he considers structurally non-negotiable." Julian sat down beside me, his usual relaxed demeanor sharpening into intense, quiet focus as he picked up a document stamped with my father's corporate letterhead. "Your father's firm, Vance Civic Development, submitted their 4th revised municipal infrastructure proposal to Aegis Systems again this afternoon," Julian revealed calmly. "My head of corporate compliance flagged it because your father listed you as a senior strategic customer liaison without your knowledge, attempting to leverage your emergency agency affiliations to boost his firm's ethical compliance score." My parents hadn't just ignored Julian because they believed he was an unpretentious, low-earning software technician. They were actively using my public service career as an uncredited commercial asset while trying to steamroll my personal life. "They judged you entirely by your perceived usefulness," I said softly, pushing the corporate papers away. "And because you wore plain sweaters and drove an 8-year-old station wagon, they assumed you had no leverage worth respecting." Julian reached across the table, covering my fingers with his warm hand. "They miscalculated because they believe power only exists when it is performative and loud. Your father's company is currently under review by our independent compliance board. I will not use my position to seek personal retribution, but I will certainly not shield him from the consequences of his own corporate misrepresentations. If his firm fraudulently used your credentials to secure municipal subcontracts, our legal team will uncover it during the standard audit. Before I could respond, my phone screen flashed on the table with a new text from my mother. Family meeting tomorrow at 5 p.m. at the studio. No excuses. Bring Julian if he insists on being involved in family matters. I stared at the message for a long moment, feeling the final threads of familial guilt snap completely. A minute later, my aunt called to warn me that my mother had already telephoned 6 extended relatives, claiming that I was experiencing a severe psychological breakdown from wedding planning stress, and that Chloe was simply stepping in to save the family weekend from administrative chaos. I looked up at Julian, my voice dropping an octave into absolute, unshakable resolve. I want you to attend the meeting tomorrow, Julian. But I don't want you to reveal who you are right away. I need them to state their demands clearly on the record while they still believe you have no voice. Julian studied my face for 3 seconds, recognizing the disciplined precision of a veteran emergency coordinator who had mapped out every exit route. "You're building a containment wall around the crisis," he said, with a quiet, approving nod. "I'll be there." I picked up my phone and typed a simple 6-word reply to my mother. "We will be there at 5. As I set the phone face down, I thought about all the years I had silently moved my chair to the far corner of the room so my sister could occupy the center of every photograph. This time, I was walking into their arena with a complete map of their deception, and nobody was moving my chair ever again. My mother's event design studio was housed inside a renovated brick warehouse on the edge of downtown Seattle, a high-end commercial space, normally filled with velvet drapery, polished brass fixtures, and grand floral installations for corporate galas. On Wednesday at 5 o'clock, the main glass conference room had been arranged with the icy, cold precision of a corporate boardroom. Bottled sparkling water sat beside every place setting. A printed agenda rested before my father at the head of the table, and fabric swatches lay scattered near my mother, as though we were gathering to choose linen colors rather than discuss her deliberate attempt to sabotage my wedding. Chloe was already seated in a tailored cream cashmere dress, her phone lying face down, and her makeup artfully applied to give her eyes a soft, vulnerable puffiness that suggested recent tears. Beside her sat Vance, her 26-year-old fiancé, a polished commercial real estate broker whose family possessed an impeccable reputation in local business circles. Liam looked distinctly uncomfortable, shifting in his leather chair and frowning as he scanned the rigid agenda in front of him. My father pointed to 2 empty chairs at the far end of the long glass table without looking up from his tablet. "Sit down, Hannah," Gregory Vance commanded, his voice dripping with executive authority. "We need to resolve this unfortunate situation before your emotional reactions cause permanent damage to this family's public standing and commercial relationships." I remained standing, my hands resting lightly on the back of my chair, while Julian sat calmly beside me in his charcoal sweater, his expression completely unreadable. "Before we discuss damage, Dad," I said, keeping my voice as even as an ice sheet, "let's define who created it." My father tapped his pen on the agenda with rhythmic annoyance. "Chloe's engagement party creates a valuable commercial opportunity for your mother's studio and provides critical networking exposure for my development firm. Her event features high-profile brand partners and media coverage that will benefit everyone. Your wedding, while lovely, is a private family affair that does not generate broader commercial value. We are simply asking for practical coordination." I stared at him, feeling a hollow, familiar chill settle in my chest as I listened to him reduce my milestone to a marketing liability. Did you just rank my wedding against my sister's engagement party based on marketing exposure? My mother leaned forward, her voice dropping into a practiced, maternal cadence designed to sound reasonable while delivering an ultimatum. Hannah, don't be dramatic. Chloe's sponsors have fixed promotional schedules. Your wedding venue can easily be rescheduled for the spring. The people who truly love you will understand if you move your date to give your sister her moment. I looked directly at Chloe. Would you move your engagement party if I asked you to? Silence, heavy as lead, filled the room before Chloe scoffed softly. That's completely different, Hannah. I have contracts attached to my date. So do I replied instantly. Yours are personal, Chloe argued, crossing her arms. Mine affect my business. There it was, the core thesis of my entire upbringing spoken aloud without a shred of shame. My life, my milestones, and my hard-earned happiness were classified as personal and therefore entirely disposable, while Chloe's desires were labeled business and treated as sacred. Without saying another word, I pulled a thick manila folder from my leather bag, opened it, and laid 4 distinct stacks of paper across the polished glass table. The florist email header with the forged digital signature, the hotel block transfer request, the photographer's cash bonus offer, and the revised family schedule. Let's discuss business then, I said, calmly. My mother's face tightened as she recognized her own corporate email address at the top of the florist sheet. You had zero legal authority to contact my vendors or impersonate me. I was simply making the weekend work for everyone, my mother snapped, her composure cracking under the weight of physical evidence. You claimed I authorized you, I pressed. You were completely unavailable, she shouted. I was coordinating emergency supply routes for families fleeing active wildfires, Mother, I said, my voice cutting through her outrage like a razor. And Chloe was throwing a temper tantrum over white orchids. Even Liam turned his head to look at Chloe, a flicker of genuine shock crossing his features at the stark, indefensible comparison. My father slammed his palm onto the glass table. Don't use dramatic, prosecutorial language with your mother, Hannah. She was trying to salvage a logistical nightmare. It is accurate, documented language, I replied, standing my ground. Chloe shoved her chair back, tears welling in her eyes on cue. Hannah has always resented me. She's trying to humiliate me in front of Liam. I turned my gaze directly onto my younger sister. I don't resent you for being loved, Chloe. I resent that you require everyone else in this family to become smaller and invisible so you can feel important. You copied my floral arrangements, tried to bribe my photographer, and attempted to kick my guests out of their hotel rooms. None of that was necessary. Tears spilled over Chloe's cheeks, and my mother immediately rushed to her side, wrapping her arms around her shoulders in a protective shield. Look at what you're doing to her, Hannah, my mother cried. That single sentence had been the emotional anthem of my childhood, a weapon used whenever Chloe got caught stealing my clothes, crashing my car, or demanding I do her college assignments. Her tears had always been treated as absolute proof of my guilt. But this time, the old programming failed to execute. I looked across the table at Chloe and asked a single, precise question. Did you offer my photographer $2,000 in cash to abandon my rehearsal dinner? Chloe hesitated, looking anxiously toward our father. Liam turned to face his fiancé, his voice quiet, steady, but stern. Answer her, Chloe. Is that true? Chloe folded her arms, remaining stubbornly silent, which spoke louder than any verbal confession. Liam slowly pushed his chair 2 inches away from her, his expression turning cold. My mother panicked, sensing the room slipping out of her control, and turned her attention to Julian. "Julian, perhaps you don't understand how close-knit families operate. Sometimes one person has to compromise for the greater good." Julian, who had remained entirely silent until this moment, tilted his head slightly and asked a 4-word question that echoed off the high warehouse ceiling. "Which person, Mrs.?" "Vance?" My mother blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" "Which person in this family is always asked to compromise?" Julian asked, his voice low, steady, and utterly commanding. My father's face flushed a deep, angry red. "You are not married to her yet, young man. This is a private family matter." "I am the man marrying her," Julian replied smoothly, "and your deliberate attempt to sabotage her wedding concerns me deeply." My father offered him the same condescending, dismissive smile he used on junior interns. "Marriage requires stability, financial responsibility, and the ability to provide, Julian. Frankly, we've always had grave concerns about your career and your ability to support our daughter." My mother chimed in immediately, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy and practiced maternal condescension. "We've had grave concerns about your career path from the moment Hannah brought you home, Julian. You call yourself a technology consultant, but in today's world, that can mean practically anything, from a freelancer to someone barely making rent. You dress in plain sweaters, drive an 8-year-old station wagon, and honestly, look like a man who repairs office printers for a living." Chloe lifted her chin, wiping away her artfully shed tears as she added her own cruel observation. "I searched for you online, Julian. There is no meaningful professional profile, no verified social media presence, and no high-end corporate press releases. For someone trying to marry into a prominent family like ours, that is extremely strange and suspicious." My father opened a black leather folder, smoothed down a sheet of paper, and offered what he clearly believed was a generous, magnanimous compromise. "Here is what we are willing to do," Gregory announced, using his authoritative corporate voice. "We will delay Hannah's wedding by 6 months. During that time, Julian, you will provide full financial statements so we can evaluate whether you are realistically equipped to support our daughter. If you pass our evaluation, your mother and I will personally help pay for a new, restructured ceremony in the spring." I stared at my father, a dry, incredulous laugh escaping my throat. "You never offered to pay a single penny for this wedding, Dad," I said softly. "Because you rushed into this engagement without consulting us or considering the family's broader commercial interests," my mother snapped. I reached into my bag, pulled out one final printed page, and placed it directly in the center of the glass table. A verbatim transcript of a voicemail my mother had accidentally recorded on my phone after failing to disconnect a call 2 weeks earlier. Chloe's voice came through clearly in the transcribed text. "If Hannah refuses to move her date, just tell the extended family she's unstable and having a severe breakdown. Nobody wants to travel for a bride who's losing her mind." My mother's recorded reply followed immediately. "We only need enough relatives to cancel so that her venue looks embarrassingly empty. She'll postpone the moment she realizes half the family won't show up." The room froze into an absolute, agonizing silence. Chloe stopped sniffling instantly, her face turning pale as paper. Liam stood up slowly from his chair, his hands trembling with quiet fury as he stared at the printed transcript. "Is that real, Chloe?" he asked, his voice shaking. Chloe grabbed his wrist frantically. "Liam, sit down! It was taken completely out of context." He pulled his arm away from her touch with cold disgust. What possible context makes sabotaging your own sister's wedding acceptable? My father reached for the page, but I picked it up before his fingers could touch it. You were never trying to coordinate two family celebrations, I said, looking my parents dead in the eye. You were deliberately trying to destroy mine. My father attempted to gather his documents, his face flushed with deep embarrassment and rising anger. This meeting is officially over. The meeting you planned is over, I replied, my voice steady as steel. Mine is just beginning. I informed them that every single vendor account had been locked with unique security passphrases. Every extended relative would be receiving an official written clarification correcting their lies, and any further interference would be documented by our attorney for potential legal action. Chloe scoffed bitterly, rolling her eyes. She thinks she's powerful because her low-budget boyfriend found a neighborhood lawyer. Julian looked at her with calm, unbothered eyes. You Googled the wrong Julian Reed. My father's expression changed first, not from recognition, but from an instinctual corporate suspicion. What is that supposed to mean? Julian pulled out his phone, opened an official webpage, and laid it face up on the glass table. The executive leadership portal of Aegis Systems displayed a high-resolution photograph of Julian standing beside a mobile emergency command unit. Beneath the photo were the words, Julian Reed, founder and executive chairman. Chloe immediately pulled out her phone to search the corporate directory, while my mother looked at my father in complete confusion. Aegis Systems? She whispered. My father didn't answer her. All the color had completely drained from his face. Aegis Systems was not a public celebrity brand, but within government contracting, hospital infrastructure, municipal emergency management, and civil engineering, it was a colossal titan. Its real-time emergency coordination software operated across 37 states, and its private market valuation exceeded $4.2 billion. More importantly to my father, Aegis was currently selecting regional engineering partners for a massive multi-state municipal infrastructure program. The exact contract Vance Civic Development had applied for 4 separate times without success. You're that Julian Reed? My father whispered, his voice cracking noticeably. The man whose career your family considered meaningless, Julian replied calmly. My mother recovered her composure with terrifying speed, her face instantly melting into a warm, manipulative smile. Why didn't you tell us, Julian? We were just being protective parents. Hannah has always been so sensitive, and sometimes we forget how strongly she reacts to stress. I stared at her, utterly stunned by her breathtaking hypocrisy. 10 minutes ago, Julian was an unviable nobody. Now she was beaming at him, trying to erase 2 years of insults in 10 seconds. Chloe laughed bitterly. So this was a test? You sat there letting us talk without telling us who you were? I use my legal name, Julian answered gently. I value my privacy. Your family's complete lack of curiosity about who I was beyond my financial utility is not deception on my part. Liam remained standing by the door, looking at Chloe with profound disappointment and disgust. Would knowing his net worth have changed how you treated him? He asked her directly. Chloe opened her mouth, but no words came out. My father desperately attempted to pivot, smoothing down his suit jacket and clearing his throat. Julian, let's separate business from family matters here. My firm's proposal for the Aegis partnership... I agree, Julian interrupted smoothly. Relief washed over my father's face, assuming he had secured his coveted commercial deal, until Julian added, That is why I will not interfere with our compliance board's independent review of your company. My father exhaled nervously. However, Julian continued, Our legal compliance team specifically requested information regarding your firm's leadership ethics. Hannah's evidence regarding your unauthorized use of her credentials raises severe corporate concerns. You would submit private family matters to a corporate board? My father demanded. I don't need to, Julian replied. Your proposal already contains fraudulent claims stating that Hannah is your senior strategic customer liaison to boost your ethical score. You listed her public service affiliations without her consent. I looked at my father in cold disgust. You used my professional reputation as a commercial asset. My mother stood up frantically. This has gone far enough. We came here to solve a wedding issue, not destroy Gregory's business. You were perfectly willing to destroy my wedding, I said, stepping toward the door with Julian. His business supports employees, she cried. And my wedding represents my dignity. Good night, Mother. The aftermath of the warehouse confrontation rippled through my family like a series of controlled, catastrophic demolitions, systematically exposing every fragile crack in their carefully constructed facade of social prestige. That very night, after reading the verbatim voicemail transcript and realizing the full, horrifying extent of the deception, Liam Vance Cole officially called off his engagement to Chloe. His decision was swift, public, and absolutely unyielding. His prominent family was not merely objecting to an overly elaborate engagement celebration, but to funding an event built on the deliberate sabotage, impersonation, and emotional abuse of another human being. Without Liam's family backing the event, the Botanical Glass venue on Lake Washington demanded an immediate, non-refundable balance payment of $12,000 by noon the following day, a sum Chloe could not remotely cover on her own. My mother frantically offered to pay the balance using her design studio's corporate credit line, but my father fiercely forbade it because his firm's business accounts had been temporarily frozen during the internal audit triggered by the Aegis corporate compliance review. By the next morning, 2 major corporate sponsors pulled their financial backing from Chloe's event, a high-end stationery brand that had received physical proof of her attempt to redirect my floral vendors, and a national lifestyle brand, unwilling to appear in what their corporate representative called an unresolved ethical and familial dispute. Chloe attempted to spin the narrative online, posting a tearful, dramatic video about jealous relatives sabotaging a young woman's dreams, but Liam shut down her campaign with a single, devastating public statement. I ended the engagement after learning that the celebration was built on fraud, impersonation, and deliberate harm to her sister. Her studio's reputation was crumbling as word spread among local Seattle event planners, and her phones were ringing off the hook, not with lucrative new client inquiries, but with angry, inquisitive calls from relatives demanding answers about the toxic lies she had fed them over the past month. She called my cell phone 34 times in 2 days and sent a dozen email threads alternating between hysterical pleas for forgiveness and furious accusations that I was an unfeeling monster destroying my own flesh and blood. When I refused to answer her calls or engage with her emotional manipulation, she showed up unannounced at my apartment on a rainy Saturday afternoon, pushing her way past me the moment I opened the front door. There was no polite greeting, no maternal warmth, and no genuine remorse in her eyes. Only pure, unadulterated panic over her unraveling social standing. "You need to fix this right now, Hannah," she demanded, her voice trembling as she paced furiously around my living room. "Chloe has locked herself in her bedroom for 3 days. Her sponsors are gone, her wedding is canceled, and your father's engineering business is being torn apart by corporate compliance auditors. You've made your point. Tell Julian to call off his legal team and restore your father's review meeting before we lose everything." I stood by the window, watching the gray Seattle rain streak down the glass, and looked at my mother with a quiet, impenetrable calm that terrified her far more than an explosive argument ever could. "Julian didn't destroy Dad's meeting, Mother," I said softly, my voice cold and grounded. "Dad destroyed it himself when he committed corporate fraud by putting my name and public service credentials on his proposal without my consent." She wrung her hands hysterically, tears finally welling in her eyes. Not tears of remorse for what she had done to me, but tears of bitter self-pity for the sudden loss of her social status. "Why do you have to be so relentless, Hannah?" she wept, clutching her designer handbag. "You keep records, you track exact words, and you back people into corners until they feel like criminals." I looked her dead in the eye and replied, "Exact words are only inconvenient when people are trying to rewrite history, to cover up their abusive choices." She sank onto my sofa, burying her face in her hands, and whispered a confession she had buried for 20 years. "Chloe was always so fragile, Hannah. She needed constant validation, constant attention, or she would spiral into chaos. You were always so capable, so independent, so strong. I thought you didn't need anything from me." I felt a cold, familiar ache in my chest, but it no longer had the power to break my spirit. "I didn't need your money, Mother," I said gently. "I needed your respect. But in this family, love was only given to whoever created the biggest emergency." I didn't let her emotional breakdown soften my resolve or dismantle the legal boundaries I was actively building to protect my future. Before she left my apartment, I handed her a document drafted by our attorney, outlining non-negotiable terms for any future interaction. I required a formal, written correction sent to every relative she had lied to regarding my mental health, a public acknowledgement that I had not caused Chloe's breakup or my father's corporate audit, and a strict legal directive that both she and my father were to stay completely away from my wedding. "People will talk if the bride's parents aren't there," she gasped, looking horrified by the public embarrassment. "Is your public image still your greatest concern after everything that has happened?" I asked quietly. 3 days later, under threat of legal action for defamation, impersonation, and contract interference, my mother sent the written correction to the entire extended family. Furthermore, Julian and I met with our estate attorney to finalize our legal protections. We established an advanced healthcare directive, appointing Julian as my sole medical power of attorney, removed my parents and sister entirely from all emergency contact lists, and explicitly barred them from any future guardianship rights or inheritance involving our future children. It was the ultimate act of self-preservation, a permanent legal wall built around our peace. A week before Chloe's canceled engagement party date, my parents made one final, desperate attempt to reclaim their social standing by hosting a smaller family dinner at my mother's design studio. They set an elaborate dining table for 30 guests, decorating it with expensive catering and grand floral arrangements that were direct, inferior copies of my original wedding design. However, after receiving my mother's written admission of fraud and realizing the full truth, the extended family chose their stance. Only 6 people showed up. A distant cousin sent me a photograph of the scene. My parents and Chloe sitting in total, heavy silence beneath towering orchid arches, surrounded by 24 empty chairs. For a brief second, I felt a flash of dark satisfaction, but it was quickly replaced by a profound, peaceful clarity. They had created the exact scene of humiliation, coldness, and emptiness they had tried so hard to inflict on my wedding day. I hadn't sabotaged their life, nor had I sought revenge. I had simply stopped acting as their emotional sponge and allowed grown adults to experience the unvarnished consequences of their own choices. Sowing seeds of deception had finally yielded a harvest of absolute isolation. On my wedding morning, a soft, golden light filtered through the pine trees surrounding a restored historic ferry terminal on Puget Sound. My mother left one final, quiet voicemail on my phone. Her voice was muted, completely stripped of her usual theatrical dominance, manipulative edge, or sharp authority. "I understand we are not invited today, Hannah," she said, her breath catching slightly against the microphone in a rare display of raw emotion. "I hope that someday, when you have your own family, you will remember that families are supposed to forgive." I sat by the wide window in my silk robe, listened to the recording once from start to finish, and then calmly tapped the screen to delete it forever, without leaving a single trace of hesitation or guilt in my heart. Forgiveness, I had learned over this grueling year of boundary building and self-preservation, was an internal process of releasing bitterness so that my own soul could heal. It was never a contractual obligation to restore unearned access to people who had proven themselves systematically unsafe. True forgiveness did not mean reopening the doors of my life to those who used intimacy as a weapon of control and exploited my generosity for their own gain. My aunt helped me fasten the delicate pearl buttons along the spine of my ivory dress. My emergency team coworkers brought hot hazelnut coffee before sunrise, and our floral designer rebuilt our ceremony installations using local cedar boughs, white anemones, and storm-fallen maple gathered near the cabin where Julian and I had spent our first anniversary. Nothing belonged to Chloe's canceled event. Nothing was sponsored for online applause, and every single flower represented an authentic, quiet devotion. When the acoustic guitar began to play and the heavy wooden doors of the terminal opened toward the glittering waters of Puget Sound, I stepped onto the aisle completely alone. I didn't walk alone because nobody loved me enough to accompany me, nor because I lacked family to walk beside me. I walked alone because I wanted those first deliberate steps into my new life to belong entirely to my own self-respect, independence, and sovereignty. I was no longer the 12-year-old girl who silently moved her chair to the shadowed corner of the room so her sister could occupy the center of every photograph. I was a 30-year-old woman who had built her own table from scratch through hard work, integrity, and unshakable resilience. Julian waited for me near the wide glass windows overlooking the water, flanked by the soft morning light and the gentle tide. He didn't look like a billionaire technology founder whose name had sent my father's corporate world into a tailspin. He looked like the gentle, steady man who had sat across from me at our kitchen table, poured my tea during my darkest hour, and asked what I wanted before anyone else dictated what I should do. When we stood hand in hand before our 84 guests, a tight-knit circle of true friends, trusted colleagues, and loyal relatives who had chosen truth over convenience, the air inside the room felt clean, honest, and profoundly unburdened. During his wedding vows, Julian looked directly into my eyes, his voice steady, warm, and echoing with deep emotional resonance across the quiet hall. "Hannah," he said, his fingers lacing tightly through mine, "I will never require you to become smaller, quieter, or less accomplished so that someone else can feel important. Your strength is not a pack mule meant to carry other people's unearned burdens, nor is it an excuse for anyone to treat you with neglect and disrespect. Your strength is the sanctuary where our family's peace will rest, and I promise to honor, protect, and stand beside it for the rest of my days." Tears spilled over my cheeks, not tears of painful memory, bitterness or lingering grief, but tears of profound, overwhelming relief and gratitude. After the ceremony, as soft jazz filled the glass hall and our guests celebrated around simple, beautifully set tables, not a single person asked why my parents or sister were absent. The people who truly mattered already understood the cost of my freedom, and everyone else recognized that a wedding is a sacred celebration of love and mutual respect, not a public courtroom where a bride is required to defend every empty chair. In the months that followed our wedding, the natural consequences of my family's choices continued to settle into their respective lives with unyielding precision. Vance Civic Development survived its corporate audit by Aegis Systems, but my father's firm lost 3 major municipal subcontracts after investigators identified inaccurate leadership representations and weak ethical controls within his proposals. He was forced to restructure his management team, relinquish his sole oversight of contract bids, and accept a severely diminished role in the local business community he had worked so hard to impress. My mother's design studio remained open, though several high-profile corporate clients quietly migrated to competing firms after learning that she had used business resources to commit contract fraud and sabotage her eldest daughter's wedding. Chloe disappeared from social media entirely for 4 months, abandoning her lifestyle channel and her thirst for online validation. When she finally returned, her content was remarkably subdued, simple, and stripped of performative luxury. On my 31st birthday, she sent me a single, short text message. I never realized how much everyone protected me from the consequences of my own actions until I had to stand alone. I read it, acknowledged the faint spark of self-awareness within her words, but chose not to reply. I was no longer responsible for completing her emotional growth. My parents remain completely outside the perimeter of my life, locked behind the legal and emotional walls I built to protect my peace. Reconciliation may be a possibility in some distant future, but it will require far more than tearful voicemails, theatrical pleas, or speeches about family obligation. It will require genuine accountability, demonstrated behavioral change, and a deep respect for boundaries they once treated as personal insults. The greatest lesson I learned through this fire was that self-respect is not revenge. Revenge would have meant using Julian's corporate power to actively crush my father's business, publicly destroying Chloe online, or turning my wedding into a petty performance designed to show them what they had lost. I did none of those things. I simply told the unvarnished truth, protected what belonged to my soul, and allowed grown adults to harvest the fruit of their own seeds. For years, I believed being dependable meant carrying whatever toxic weight my family dropped on my shoulders. I was wrong. Real strength is not measured by how much abuse you can endure in silence. Real strength is having the courage to put the weight down, step away from the table where respect is never served, and build a home where your worth is never questioned.